It is a wet Tuesday evening in November 1958. The street lamps are struggling against the thick pea-soup fog, and the pavement glistens with rain. You turn the handle of a chipped, green-painted door, and a brass bell on a coiled spring announces your arrival with a sharp, jangling cling-clang. Instantly, the cold is forgotten. You are enveloped in a sensory embrace that is unique to this era. A rich, chaotic perfume of paraffin oil, smoked bacon, damp wool, and the dusty sweetness of loose biscuits. The shop is small, crammed from floor to ceiling with tins, jars, and boxes, a fortress of provisions against the winter night. Behind the high wooden counter, a man in a brown warehouse coat doesn't just look up. He knows you. He knows your mother. He knows you need a quarter of tea, and he knows you'll probably pay on Friday. This isn't just a retail transaction, and this isn't just a shop. You have stepped out of the dark and into the beating heart of the British community. To understand the corner shop, you have to first understand the kitchen of the 1950s. Today, we stand before humming, double-door fridge freezers packed with enough food to survive a siege. But in 1955, the average British home was a place of perishable fragility. Fewer than 10% of households owned a refrigerator. There were no chest freezers in the garage. There were only stone pantries, meat safes with wire mesh to keep the flies off, and the cool slab of the scullery. This simple technological fact dictated the rhythm of our entire lives. You couldn't do a big shop. Milk went sour in a day, bread went stale, meat had to be bought and cooked within hours, and so the British housewife didn't just go shopping. She went foraging every single day, rain or shine. This necessity created a landscape where the shop came to you. In the terraced streets of industrial towns, from the back-to-backs of Leeds to the red brick rows of the Midlands, you were never more than a few hundred yards from a glowing window. These weren't just convenience stores in the modern sense. They were the community's collective larder. They were often converted front rooms of ordinary houses. A bay window would be ripped out and replaced with plate glass. A bell was wired up above the door. The family lived upstairs, their domestic life bleeding into the business below. If you listened carefully while waiting for your quarter of ham, you could hear the shopkeeper's children arguing over the wireless in the parlor behind the curtain, or the smell of their own dinner mingling with the scent of the shop's firelighters and firewood. For the shopkeeper, the Mr. Arkwrights of the real world, this was a life of grueling, relentless servitude. We look back now with a cozy nostalgia, imagining a friendly chat over the counter, but the reality was a 14-hour day that started before dawn and ended long after the pub kicked out. The day began at 5 a.m. with the thud of the newspaper bundles hitting the doorstep. Before the first factory whistle blew, the shopkeeper had to sort the Daily Mirrors and the Times, marking them up for the paper boys. Then came the milk delivery, the bread delivery, and the sweeping of the front step. They were open all hours, not out of greed, but out of survival. In a working-class district, a shift worker might need a packet of Woodbines at 6 a.m., and a housewife might run out of sugar at 9 p.m. If the light was on, the shop was open. The inventory in these places was a triumph of organization over space. To a modern eye used to the sterile, wide aisles of a superstore, a 1950s corner shop would look like a hoarder's cave. But there was a logic to the chaos. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were stacked with tins of Fray Bentos pies, jars of Shipham's paste, packets of reckless blue whitener for the wash, and bottles of camp coffee. Nothing was pre-packaged in plastic. Everything was loose, heavy, and tangible. There was no self-service. The very idea would have been considered rude or worse, an invitation to theft. You stood at the counter, the altar of the shop, and you waited your turn. And while you waited, you participated in the slow, steady hum of the neighborhood. You saw who was buying the expensive bacon and who was making do with the offcuts. You saw who looked tired. You saw who was buying aspirin for a hangover. The corner shop owner wasn't just a retailer. They were the keeper of the street's secrets, and nowhere was this more evident than in the handling of the most sensitive book in the building, the ledger. If the counter was the stage, then the slate, or the tick book, was the script that kept the drama running. In the days before credit cards, overdrafts, and payday loans, the British working class ran on a fragile economy of trust. For millions of families, the weekly wage packet arrived on a Friday. By Wednesday, the money was often gone. In a modern supermarket, this would mean going hungry. The electronic till says declined, and that is the end of the conversation. But in the corner shop of the 1950s and 60s, there was a safety net woven from human relationships. "Put it on the slate, please, Mr. Roberts." It was a phrase whispered in low tones, often with a quick glance over the shoulder to make sure the neighbors weren't listening, though they almost certainly were doing the same thing. The shopkeeper would reach under the counter and pull out a battered, grease-stained exercise book. He would lick his pencil, find your family's page, and scroll down the items. "My next loaf. 'Kiss butter. 2 O's tea." This book was the most important financial document in the community. It held the family together until payday. The shopkeeper knew exactly how much credit each family was good for. He knew that Mrs. Jenkins always paid up on Friday evening, regular as clockwork, straight after her husband got home from the pit or the factory. He knew that the Jones family was struggling because the dad was off sick, so he might let their bills slide for an extra week, perhaps slipping a bag of broken biscuits into the basket for the kids, free of charge. This wasn't charity. It was a mutual pact of survival. The shopkeeper depended on the loyalty of the street just as much as they depended on him. If he refused credit, he lost a customer for life. If he gave too much, he went bust. He had to be a blend of accountant, actuary, and social worker, making split-second risk assessments based on the look in a woman's eyes or the fraying of her coat. For the children of the era, the slate was a source of complex emotions. There was the pride of being trusted. "Tell your mum it's fine." And the crushing, burning shame of being sent to the shop with a note, only to be told, gently but firmly, "Tell your dad he needs to settle up before you can have any more." Walking back home with an empty basket, the weight of the family's financial precariousness resting on your small shoulders, was a rite of passage. It taught us the value of money in a visceral way. We saw the direct link between our father's labor and the food on the table, and when payday finally came, the ritual of settling up was a moment of supreme dignity. The wife would march into the shop, purse heavy with cash, and clear the slate. The shopkeeper would draw a thick line through the debt, a satisfying stroke of the pencil that meant the family was solvent again. The slate was wiped clean. The balance was restored. It was a cycle of debt and redemption that bound the community together in a way that a faceless credit card statement never could. If the ledger was the financial heart of the shop, the counter was its theater. Shopping in the 1950s and 60s wasn't the passive, solitary act it is today. You didn't wander down an aisle, tossing hermetically sealed plastic packets into a trolley. You participated in a performance, a ritual of weighing, slicing, and wrapping that required patience, skill, and a fair amount of conversation. Today, we have lost the physical connection to our food. We buy cheese in perfectly rectangular, sweating blocks. We buy meat hidden under gas-flushed plastic. But back then, the food had a presence. Take the butter. It didn't come in foil-wrapped packs. It arrived in the shop as a colossal golden barrel or a giant cubic slab. When you asked for a half-pound, the shopkeeper would pick up 2 wooden paddles, the butter pats. With a dexterity that a modern surgeon might envy, he would slice a chunk from the main block, and then, using a rhythmic slap-slap-slap motion, he would beat it into a perfect, neat rectangle. He would then wrap it in grease-proof paper, folding the corners with a crisp, geometric precision. There was no machine involved, just the eye and the hand. Then there was the cheese. A massive wheel of cheddar, covered in cheesecloth, sat on the counter like a cornerstone. The shopkeeper used a wire with 2 wooden handles, a garret for dairy, to slice through it. He would eyeball the width, pull the wire taut, and slice. He would drop the wedge onto the brass scales, and 9 times out of 10, the needle would settle exactly on the requested weight. "Just a scraping over, love. Is that all right?" he'd ask. It always was. But the star of the show was the bacon slicer. Every corner shop had one, a heavy, red enamel beast, usually a berkel, with a gleaming, lethal circular blade. You could choose your thickness. "Number 4 for a sandwich, number 6 for a grill," your mother would instruct. The shopkeeper would turn the heavy handle, and the machine would hiss and clack, 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 as the rashers fell, one by one, onto the sheet of paper. The smell of the smoked meat would instantly fill the small room. You weren't just buying bacon, you were watching it being prepared for you. And for the child standing on tiptoes, staring over the counter, the main attraction was the biscuit display. These weren't in packets. They were in large, square tin boxes with glass lids, stacked against the front of the counter. The shopkeeper would reach down, unscrew the lid, and the smell of custard creams or bourbons would waft up, a sugary, vanilla breeze. If you were lucky, or if money was tight, you would ask the magic question, "Have you got any broken biscuits today, Mr. Evans?" Because the tins were handled daily, the biscuits at the bottom would crumble. These were gathered up and sold for pennies a bag. To a child in the 1960s, a bag of broken biscuits was a lucky dip of crumbs and chocolate, a chaotic feast that tasted better because it was cheap and because it was a secret shared between you and the man in the brown coat. Beyond the theater of food, the corner shop served a far more critical function. It was the unofficial intelligence agency of the street. In an era before mobile phones, social media, or even widespread landlines, the shop was the hub where all information was exchanged, filtered, and broadcast. If you wanted to know who had died, who had given birth, whose husband had walked out, or which factory was laying people off, you didn't buy a newspaper. You bought a pint of milk. The shopkeeper was the central node in this gossip network. He stood at the intersection of 100 lives. He knew that Mrs. Higgins at number 42 was buying more sherry than usual, a sure sign of trouble at home. He knew that the young couple at number 10 were buying the expensive cuts of meat, a sign of a promotion or a win on the pools. This network wasn't just about nosiness. It was a safety mechanism. If an elderly widow didn't show up for her daily loaf of bread and quarter of tea, the alarm was raised instantly. "Has anyone seen Mrs. Gable today?" the shopkeeper would ask the next customer. Within an hour, someone would be knocking on her door. Today, a person can lie undiscovered in their flat for weeks. In the golden age of the corner shop, you couldn't be invisible for a morning, and integral to this system were the runners, the children. We were the carrier pigeons of the 1960s economy. Long before we were old enough to understand what we were buying, we were sent on errands. "Go down to the shop and get me 20 cansitas and a box of matches, and put it on the book." It seems unthinkable now, sending a 7-year-old to buy cigarettes, but back then it was standard practice. You would trot down the street, clutching a note written in your mother's handwriting. "Please give John 20 players number 6. The shopkeeper wouldn't bat an eyelid. He would hand over the lethal packet, perhaps tossing in a few fruit salad chews for your trouble. We bought items that have long since vanished from the modern lexicon. We bought blue bag for the washing, a small block of blue dye to make whites look whiter. We bought Vim scouring powder. We bought paraffin for the heater, carrying it back in a metal can that stank so badly it made your eyes water. We were trusted with money, we were trusted with crossing the road, and we were trusted to bring the change back. The shop was the first place we learned independence. It was the boundary of our world, the furthest point we were allowed to roam. "Don't go past the shop," was the universal parental instruction. It was our lighthouse, our boundary marker and our first taste of the adult world. The end of the corner shop didn't come with a bang. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation that began, ironically, with a law designed to help the consumer. The death warrant was signed in 1964 with the abolition of resale price maintenance, RPM. For decades, the price of goods in Britain had been fixed. A tin of Heinz beans cost the same in a tiny village shop as it did in a giant department store. The manufacturers set the price, and by law, nobody could sell it for less. This protected the small shopkeeper. He couldn't be undercut. He could compete on service, on location, and on personality, knowing that he wouldn't be beaten on price. But the 1960s was the era of modernization. The government, under pressure to lower the cost of living, scrapped RPM. Suddenly, the gloves were off. The emerging supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Fine Fare, could now use their buying power to slash prices. They could sell a tin of beans for pennies, less than the corner shop could even buy it for from the wholesaler. The price war had begun, and it was a massacre. The corner shop owner, with his small stockroom and his single van run to the cash and carry, didn't stand a chance. He watched as his customers, loyal for years, began to drift away. At first, it was just the big shop. They would go to the supermarket on a Saturday to stock up on the dry goods, the tins, the sugar, the flour, because it was cheaper. They still came to him for the perishables, the milk, the bread, the bacon. But then, the supermarkets got smarter. They started selling fresh food. They started selling bread that stayed soft for a week, thanks to the new Chorleywood process. They introduced the loss leader, selling items at a loss just to get people through the door. The shopkeeper stood behind his counter, surrounded by his unsold stock, and watched the ledger book grow thinner. The slate became a liability. The customers who still used it were the ones who couldn't afford to go to the supermarket. The poorest, the elderly, the struggling. The shop became a lender of last resort. The cash flow dried up. The lights that used to burn until 9 p.m. started to flicker out. The brass bell rang less often. The silence in the shop grew heavier, broken only by the hum of the fridge and the turning of the pages of a newspaper that nobody had bought. If the price war weakened the corner shop, it was the arrival of two new technologies in the 1970s that delivered the killing blow: the car and the chest freezer. These two inventions fundamentally rewired the British brain. In the 1950s, shopping was a daily, pedestrian activity. You walked to the shop because you had to carry the bags home and because the food wouldn't keep. But as car ownership exploded in the 1970s, the geography of our lives expanded. Suddenly, you weren't tethered to your own street. You could drive 3 miles to the new hypermarket on the edge of town, and once you got there, you could fill the boot. Because now, you had somewhere to put it all: the freezer. The chest freezer, usually a humming white sarcophagus kept in the garage or the spare room, was the status symbol of the decade. It promised liberation. "Be freezer," the advert said. "Shop once a month." It was a seductive promise for the overworked housewife. Why trudge to the corner shop in the rain every morning for a loaf of bread when you could buy 10 loaves at the hypermarket, freeze them, and just defrost one a day? This shift destroyed the rhythm of the corner shop. It turned the daily customer into the distress customer. People stopped coming in for their full order. They only came in when they had run out of something. They came for a pint of milk because the fridge was empty. They came for a packet of cigarettes because the garage was closed. They came for a battery. The corner shop was demoted. It went from being the primary source of sustenance to being the emergency backup. The shopkeeper became the person you used when you had forgotten something, or when it was snowing, or when you couldn't be bothered to drive to Tesco. The relationship changed too. The slate died out because you can't run a credit system for strangers who only pop in once a month for a Mars bar. The counter, once the stage for conversation, became a barrier to speed. The old wooden fittings were ripped out and replaced with self-service metal shelving, a desperate attempt to mimic the supermarket style. But it was a pale imitation. The shop felt colder, emptier. By the late 1970s and early 80s, the writing was on the wall. The children of the shopkeepers, the ones who had grown up listening to the bell ring, didn't want to take over. They had seen their parents struggle. They saw the 14-hour days, the lack of holidays, the declining profits. They went to college. They got office jobs. And so, when the old man finally hung up his brown coat, there was nobody to catch it. The 1980s brought a visual plague to the British High Street and the terraced rows of the industrial north. It was the plague of the whitewashed window. One by one, the lights went out. The first sign was usually a handwritten card in the window, closing down sale. Then the stock would thin out until the shelves looked like a rib cage picked clean. Finally, the door was locked, the blind was pulled down, and the window was painted over with a slurry of white cleaning fluid or simply boarded up with plywood. If you walk through any British town today, you can still see the scars. You pass houses that look almost normal, but not quite. The front window is too big. The door is on the corner, cut at a diagonal angle. There is a faint, ghostly outline of a sign above the lintel, where the paint has peeled away to reveal the shadow of the words family grocer or tobacconist. These are the ghost shops. They have been converted into flats or front rooms. Where once there was a display of tin soldiers and sherbet fountains, there is now a net curtain and a television set. Where the brass bell once rang 100 times a day, there is silence. But the real tragedy wasn't architectural. It was social. When the corner shop closed, the elderly were cast adrift. For the widow living alone at number 42, the daily trip to the shop wasn't about commerce. It was her only guaranteed human contact of the day. She didn't go to the shop because she needed a single rasher of bacon. She went to hear a human voice. She went to be recognized. She went to hear Mr. Roberts ask, "How's the hip today, love?" When the shop closed, that lifeline was severed. She couldn't walk the 2 miles to the new Asda. She couldn't carry heavy bags from the bus stop. So she retreated. The Meals on Wheels van might drop off a hot dinner, but the driver didn't have time to lean on the counter and chat about the weather for 20 minutes. The community contracted. The eyes on the street, the shopkeeper who watched out for everyone, were blinded. We became a nation of neighbors who nodded politely but didn't know each other's names, living behind closed doors, separated by a silence that the jangle of the shop bell used to fill. Nature abhors a vacuum, and commerce is no different. In the last 20 years, the pendulum has swung back. We realized, too late, that driving to an out-of-town hypermarket for a pint of milk was a madness of its own. And so, the shops have returned to our street corners, but they have returned wearing a uniform. Walk into a modern Tesco Express or a Sainsbury's local today. They often occupy the very same buildings where the old family grocer once stood. But the soul of the building has been exorcised. The first thing that hits you is the light. It is a harsh, clinical, fluorescent glare that leaves no shadow. The air is different too. It doesn't smell of bacon or sawdust. It smells of ozone, refrigerator coolant, and floor sanitizer. It is the smell of efficiency. These are not corner shops in the true sense. They are convenience stores. The distinction is vital. The old shop was built around community. The new shop is built around speed. The layout is designed to get you in and out as fast as possible. You navigate a maze of high shelves, blocked by roll cages of stock being unpacked by staff who are often wearing headsets, talking to someone else. The staff are no longer the owners. They are transient, working a shift on a rota, paid minimum wage. They don't know that your husband is ill. They don't know you prefer the burnt loaf. They don't have the authority to put anything on the slate. Because the till is a computer that allows no negotiation. The theater of the counter has been replaced by the tyranny of the self-checkout. unexpected item in the baggage area. It is the robotic mantra of modern Britain. We stand there, scanning our own barcodes, bagging our own shopping, interacting with a machine instead of a human being. And where the shopkeeper once stood as a guardian of the street, we now have a security guard. A man in a high-vis vest stands by the door, not to greet you, but to watch you. The trust is gone. The old shopkeeper knew you wouldn't steal a tin of beans because he knew your dad. The modern corporation knows nobody, so it suspects everybody. We have regained the utility of the local shop. We can buy a ready meal at 10 p.m. We can buy a Costa coffee from a machine. We have convenience in abundance. But we walk out of those sliding automatic doors feeling strangely empty, clutching a plastic bag in one hand and a receipt in the other, having spoken to absolutely no one. It is easy to look back at the past through rose-tinted spectacles. We must remember that the era of the corner shop was also an era of scarcity, of limited choice, and of prices that took a heavy toll on the weekly wage. We cannot pretend that the arrival of the supermarket, with its abundance of fresh fruit in winter and its affordable staples, wasn't a miracle for the working-class family. And yet, standing in the silent, sanitized aisle of a modern superstore, it is hard not to feel that a vital piece of our national soul has been traded away in the pursuit of efficiency. The corner shop was the physical embodiment of a society that relied on people, not systems. It was built on the understanding that we were all in this together. The Slate was more than a credit agreement. It was a declaration of trust between neighbors. The gossip over the counter was more than idle chatter. It was the glue that held the community together, ensuring that nobody, not the elderly, not the struggling, not the lonely, slipped through the cracks unnoticed. We have gained the world in our shopping baskets. We have strawberries in December and spices from the Orient. We have self-checkouts that save us 30 seconds of conversation. But we have paid for it with our isolation. We have retreated behind our front doors, safe in the knowledge that we don't need our neighbors to survive anymore. So, the next time you rush into a convenience store to grab a pint of milk, scanning it yourself without breaking stride, spare a thought for the man in the brown coat who used to know your name. Listen for the ghost of the brass bell jangling above the door. It is the echo of a time when shopping was slow, life was hard, but the street felt like a family. And perhaps, in our rush to modernize, that sense of belonging was the one thing we couldn't afford to lose.